Hey, Kristy Woodson Harvey, we are so happy to have you back in the Lowcountry Book Club. Thank you so much for making time to talk with us about your wonderful book that we all enjoyed so much, A Happier Life. I have it right here. Okay, I just finished this last night because I've been crazy, but that's a whole nother story. But I just finished this last night and I loved it so much. Everybody did.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for choosing A Happier Life. And you know how much I love your book club. So I'm so excited to be here with you guys.
Well, we're excited to have you. So, first of all, I have to ask you, how much fun was it to write about Beaufort, your adopted hometown? And maybe you could talk about that a little bit. And also, if I say it wrong, it's because everybody knows there's a Beaufort in South
Yep.
Carolina that's spelled exactly the same way. And I'm more used to talking about that. But anyway, tell us about your adopted hometown, how you came to be there, and what it was to use that for a book as itself, not as a imaginary.
Yeah. Well, it was a lot of fun. And I think, I've lived here full time for 7 years now, which is kind of crazy. So I'll give you a little backstory on Beaufort and me. We have kind of a long love affair. So I did not come here growing up. I did never had been here. I hadn't even heard of it until I was 19, and I was with some friends, and we came for a party over the summer, and we pulled over the old Graydon Paul drawbridge, and there was this little like "Welcome to historic Beaufort, NC" sign, and we pulled downtown, and it's a town of all these like pre-revolutionary white clapboard houses, and there's this beautiful waterfront, and there are wild horses out on the island across the way, and it's this very charming little downtown. And I was like, I'm gonna live here one day. And it was a crazy thing to say, and of course I didn't mean it. Like, it wasn't something that I was like, oh, let me plot a way to live in Beaufort. I just said it like you do when you're 19, I guess.
Yeah, yeah.
And or any age, but when you just say something offhandedly, but you don't really mean it. And so a couple years later, I met my husband, Will, or he, Will, who became my husband, and his dad lived here, and we started spending more time in Beaufort, and we got married and eventually bought a house here. And I just loved it. And I think the more that we spent time here on the weekends and like in the summers, and the more I really started thinking, maybe we could live here, maybe we can make this work. So we decided to move here for 1 year a few years ago, and we've never left. So I think we've lived here full time for 7 years. And it was really the first time that I thought, okay, I really know what it's like to live in Beaufort. I think I can do justice to that and like adequately portray what it is to be here as like a full timer. And so I think it was the first time that I thought, okay, this is what I'm going to do. And it worked on a number of levels for this book. I needed a town that, was old enough that generations of the same family could have lived there. And I needed a town that was, had enough tradition to it that we could see Keaton in the modern day doing some of the same things that Rebecca St. James is doing in the 70s or even in the 30s or 40s in parts of the story. So I wanted to have that kind of continuity to their stories. So Beaufort just seemed like the perfect fit.
Well, I enjoyed reading about it. I don't think I've ever actually been there. I've been to a lot of coastal North Carolina, but I don't think I've ever been there. And I would love to go. It sounds like a beautiful place.
It's going to be a little.
So about the characters, because there's a lot of questions in the group, and we're going to get to all of them. They sort of fall into several different categories, but I wanted to ask you, as I always do, about the characters, about
Yeah.
Keaton and about her mom specifically. They have an
Okay.
interesting relationship, I think.
Yeah.
Keaton seems to feel that she practically raised herself with her mom not being as involved as maybe some of the other mothers. And then as the book develops, we get some sense as to why Virginia took that approach. But I just wondered if you wanted to talk to us a little bit about that relationship dynamic.
Yes, I definitely want to. Okay. And I'm just going to give the caveat if y'all are listening to this. Susan and I discussed this before, but I am super excited because this is the first time that I'm talking about this book with spoilers. And this is going to be a big one. So if you haven't read the book, now's a good time to tune out. But yeah, so I think that was one of the things that I had. I don't think the most fun. It wasn't necessarily like fun to write their dynamic, but I put a lot of thought into the dynamics of how Rebecca St. James dying suddenly and tragically would affect her daughter Virginia and how it would cause her to be a mother in maybe a different way. And I think it's really, really interesting to look at the ways in which we are shaped in relationship to our families, which is what I think really happened in this family. I mean, so you had Virginia, who had these really doting parents and a really doting mother in particular, who did everything for her and was always the person that she ran to, was always the person that she could count on. And then suddenly she was gone in her early 20s. And so I think, part of Virginia's story, she wasn't sure she wanted to have children at all after experiencing a loss like that and knowing what it could do to a person. But when she did, her main goal that she sort of reveals to Keaton at the end of the book was she wanted to make her children as independent as possible. And so there were a lot of things that she did in raising them that did seem very hands off. And I think to an extent, I don't know if she says this in the book, but I hope that readers get the feeling of this, that she does kind of love them at a little bit of a distance because she has lost in such a big way that she is a little bit afraid to kind of mother them in the way that she was mothered. And it was interesting to me. It's one of those things that I haven't lived it. I haven't experienced it. So this was basically just my thinking about, how would this affect someone and what is the ripple effect through multiple generations of a relationship like this. But a woman actually came to one of my events and said, like, has this happened to you? And how did you know? And I said, well, it hasn't. And she said that her mother died actually of alcoholism when she was like 13 years old. And she said, I raised my children from the time they were born. She's like, I think that sometimes they give me a hard time about like not being the warmest, fuzziest mother. And she's like, but I couldn't be because I needed them to be able to take care of themselves. And that's how I raised them. And I thought that was so interesting. And I was like, okay, well, there's one person in the world that like related to that. So I really
like that resonates with her.
Yeah,
I'm sure it resonated with a lot of people. I mean, I'm certain that's not an isolated story, but no, you did a great job with that. The other theme that sort of seemed this stuck out to me, and this might just be the way the mood that I'm in right now. I don't even know. But it seemed to me there was more romance in this book. It was more, the romance storyline was more centric. I mean, you always have a little romance, but this one seemed to have more. Was that intentional? Is it just me?
I'm laughing? The only reason I'm laughing is because I literally, as I was getting on here, I was on my phone and I was like reading this review and she was like, this one is not as romance centric as some of Kristy's other books. It's more focused. Isn't that hilarious? That's how I'm laughing. No, I do think it depends. I do think it's like, I think it's kind of what you make it a little bit. Like, I think it's how you read it, but yeah, I wanted to have two love stories in this book. And I wanted one to be, Rebecca and Townsend St. James's love story is a little different because it is kind of a like more forever love. It's kind of, you do see how they got together. You do see them falling in love at the beginning, but it's definitely, you're seeing more of that. Like, what does it look like to be with someone for a lifetime and to have a family together and then to face what it's going to be like to not be together? What does that look like and how does that feel? And that was really the impetus for this story, which I won't elaborate on too much because maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later. But that was really what made me want to write the story to begin with. And so Keaton was almost like the lens through which I was telling the story. She was kind of like my entry point into Rebecca and Townsend's story to begin with. But but what's more fun than like stranger comes to town and falls in love with the grumpy neighbor? I mean, I wanted something. I think I thought a lot about in this book because it does have some heavier moments than some of my other books. I wanted there to be some lighter moments too, whereas maybe some of them are maybe a little more like in the middle. I wanted to be some light to balance out some of the heavy so that you still walk away with that like, nice beach read kind of feel.
Well, you wrote salt in so that gave everything the warm and fuzzy, right?
Yeah, there you go. I mean, just throw a dog in when in doubt, right?
So, all right, let's talk about some of those heavier topics. And so I'm going to read you a couple of things that people in the group wrote, and then we'll talk about the whole the end of life topic, and of course how that ties into Beck's and Townsend's relationship and their forever story. And was that the main story you wanted to tell? Was their story? And then I guess so Kristy Rosen says that you've written about end-of-life decisions before in Peachtree Bluff. Why this topic? Personally, I applaud her for spotlighting the important topic, but there's been robust comments on book groups. I'm wondering what those robust comments are now. I've missed them. If they've been in our group, I haven't seen them. So I don't know. Maybe you know what that's about. I'll have to ask Chrissy. But then also Michelle McKay said that she wanted to know, was it hard for you to write Bex and Townsend's plans, knowing how it would affect their children? And then someone else piped in and said, do you have experience with either of these diseases or losing family early in life? So I thought I would throw all that at you and let you talk about that, because it's really one big topic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, so initially, the reason that I got the idea for this story, and I haven't gotten to tell this part at all because I haven't had any spoilers, so this is good. But I had a great aunt and uncle that passed away in a plane crash before I was born, in their own plane. They were both expert pilots. There were a lot of kind of unusual circumstances around their death. They lived in Key West, but they were flying to the mountains, and they, their family knew that they had left in the plane, but they sort of disappeared. They couldn't find them. So, I mean, they presumed that the plane had crashed, but no one really knew what had happened to them. And it took a couple of weeks to find them. And actually in real life, my grandmother worked really hard to keep them in the media because, if you keep people in the media, hopefully they'll be found. And she ended up getting a phone call from a psychic who told her the latitude and longitude coordinates of her sister and the plane. And at the same time, like while they were trying to decide, like, is this credible? Do we give this to the authorities? Which, I mean, I guess they were going, you give anything that you can, right? Yeah. There was a group of Boy Scouts hiking in the woods and they found the plane.
Was it at those coordinates?
Yeah, with the exact latitude and longitude coordinates.
Oh my gosh.
So obviously I didn't put that in the book because it doesn't, I mean, that would be super convenient for us as a writer, right? Oh, good, a psychic called. That's what happened to them. The end. Like, wow, that was a real heavy lift. But so this is what gave me the idea for the story. So about 5 years ago, so we had talked about this a lot. I was just interested in this story, and it wasn't, I will go ahead and say right up front, I definitely think that they died in an accident for the reason that whatever commenter said. I don't think that they would consciously have said, oh, we're just going to crash the plane and leave our kids, because their kids were, one was in college and one was in law school. They just wouldn't have done that. Right. So I don't think that's what they did. However, this is what gave me the idea. So about 5 years ago, my grandmother and I were talking about her sister just for some reason. And I don't know if she brought it up or I did, but it was in passing. It was like a casual comment. It wasn't like a big conversation about them. But I said something. She always used to say it was the hardest thing that ever happened to her, of course, because they were missing and it was so full of anguish for her. But she said, I look back on it now and I think that maybe it was all okay, because my sister always used to say she never wanted to grow old. And I was like, oh, and I didn't think anything about it. So the next day, their son, who's my grandmother, so my grandparents kind of became like sort of the pseudo parents family for their two nephews and, my mom and her sisters, and they all just kind of like took them in after this because they were grown, but you still need family to have holidays with and all of that. And they had lost both their parents, obviously. So he flew to Salisbury to see my grandparents, flew himself, and he had just had heart surgery. And I was scolding him. And I said, there's no way you were cleared to fly after this. And he said, no, it really wasn't. And he's like, but I love to fly so much, which the irony of that just kills me. Yeah. And he said, my dad always used to say that he didn't want to live when he couldn't fly. And I just got this head to toe chills. Like, she didn't want to grow old. He didn't want to live when he couldn't fly. Like, what if there was something we didn't know? What if they planned it? Again, I don't think they did, but I thought, what a great story. And, to the point of the person who said, them doing that to their children, I'm not saying that that's a decision that I would make or something that I necessarily condone, but if you've lived through family members who have dementia and Alzheimer's, and you've lived through a family member who dies from a very quick cancer, that is, it's rough.
It's rough. An understandable decision that somebody would make.
Yeah. So is that harder on the family? you know, I don't know. That's the point of the book, right? Like the point of the story is to think about, if you know this is your end, if you know this is coming, you know what, it's just a like a decision that they made, and
Well,
just something I wanted to explore. I thought it was interesting to explore the idea of, you know, what how people choose different
right.
paths.
And is it easier on the kids to not live through those weeks or months where their parents are just desperately ill and with I can't even talk about Alzheimer's. My dad
Right.
has Alzheimer's.
It,
I
it,
can't, that
and my
that's a
grandmother had
whole
it for 10 years, and it's
yeah,
hell. It's
yeah.
hell on your family. And you
Oh yeah,
can't help it. You would never choose it, but it's horrible. It's
it
horrible.
is. It's a
So
horrible disease.
the catch in this book that I think makes it a little more complicated, because as our writers, we're always trying to throw a little bit of a wrench in the plan. I think Bex and Townsend thought our kids will know instantly what happened. They left all the
Right,
clues in the house. They left
right,
everything behind for their children to know instantly what happened to
right,
them. It's just they never went and found out.
right.
So, is it a harder life for them than not knowing what happened to their parents? For sure. But I don't think that was Bex and Townsend's
No.
plan. I think they thought, oh, they're going to know right away what happened.
Well, they said, well, Townsend said, Virginia will know immediately,
Yeah.
where we are, so and once she found that note, she did. She knew
Yeah.
immediately what had
Yeah.
happened.
Yeah.
So, or the poem, but anyway. Okay, so I understand why you wrote about the way their story evolved, but what made you want to write about end of life topics in general? I mean, is that a
Just in general, it wasn't even I don't so when I okay, so when I wrote that part in Peachtree Bluff, um my mother-in-law was dying of breast cancer, and it was just something we had been talking about. I mean, she didn't
yeah,
do that. We didn't do that. She died of natural causes after, 10 years. But it was just something we were talking about. And just to be honest, I needed Emerson to have a big secret. And it's sort
right.
of, I think because I was like living in that moment, I think that was something that I thought of because again, it was something that I was living through and we were talking about. And I thought, oh, this would be like an interesting thing to explore. And but for this, I really wasn't even trying to explore that. It was just like I almost think it was writing a happier ending to a story that was
Right,
really sad in my own family. I think there's something about, choice and agency that sometimes makes things feel a little more bearable. And obviously I didn't live through that, right? So it doesn't weigh on me in the way that it did some of my, other family members. But I think just the idea of what if someone did choose this? And I think that's always how a story starts for me. So I can look at every one of my books and they always sort of start with a what if, what if, what
right,
if, or what would it be like? And I think that is, and I think maybe it's because it's something that I just don't feel like I would ever be I'd be brave enough to do, but I think there are people who are. And so I think it's interesting to think about, under what circumstances would people make that choice and what would push you in that direction.
right.
This in the same way in Dear Carolina. I mean, I've never given up a baby and I'm glad I didn't have to, but my thought process on that was what would it be like for someone to have to give up their child? And in the Peachtree Love series, what would it be like to carry this huge secret from your children for your entire life? I mean, I think everything that I've written is um, just something that I was wondering about or something I was
Right.
interested about or something that I just wanted to kind of explore that I think is an interesting thing to discuss, really.
Well, those are all very interesting topics for sure. So there's a lot of flying in this book. Is that something you have an interest in doing? Do you fly? Do you want to fly? I mean, not
Hate.
like on the plane someone else, not Delta. I'm not talking Delta
You mean
here.
like, yes, like, am I
You
flying?
fly
Yes.
your own planes. Yeah.
No, and I actually thought about getting my pilot's license while I was writing this book, but ironically, I hate to fly. And well, maybe this is why I hate to fly. Like, let's be honest. But I mean, that's a strong word. I'm fine with it now. Like, like getting on a big plane, like I'm fine. I don't really think about it too much, but I, for years, hated to fly, like really hated it. But I had to get over that pretty quickly. I think I mean, I've always done it. I've never loved it. I've always done it. But I think the frequency at which I do it now is just something that I don't even really think about that much anymore. But in order to do the plane research for this book, I did actually go in a 1970. I think the one in the plane is a 1973 Beechcraft Bonanza, and the one that I was in was actually, I think, a 1976 Beechcraft Bonanza. A very similar aircraft, and very similar, and the plane that my great aunt and uncle were in. And it actually answered a lot of questions for me about, I never could understand, the theory is that my great uncle had a heart attack, and that when he fell on the yoke of the plane, because for a long time it bothered my grandmother, because my great aunt was a great pilot. And it bothered her, like, why? But so once I was in that plane, so like if you and I were flying that plane together, and you're the pilot and I'm the co-pilot, like you're like, we're touching each other. Like the plane is really tiny. And so the yoke is actually connected. So the yoke is like what you actually, pull back on and like use to fly the plane. And so if I fell on it, you couldn't
do anything.
Yeah. So that was an interesting kind of like real life moment for me to be like, oh yeah, like that makes a lot of sense. Like being in that plane, like I could really visualize, what that would have been like, which was obviously hard and crazy. But yeah, I felt like I needed to like be in it and hear it and like know what it felt like and smelled like, and all of those things to write about it. But yeah, there was an irony there, because that's not something that I love to do. My husband's dying to get his pilot's license, and I'm like, no.
That would scare me. I don't think I'd ever be interested in doing that. I don't like flying on tiny planes at all. Honestly, I don't love flying either. I mean, I do it too, but I don't love it. If I can drive, I do. Anyway, so a lot of other folks had questions about the whole Catholic Protestant storyline, and wanted to know, why you wrote about that. Some of them, I'm just going to read you a few of the comments. Chrissy says, I know it was still an issue in 1980. My first boyfriend had to break up with me, or his grandparents wouldn't pay for college because I was Catholic. And then Pat Tarter says, I'm Protestant and still see remnants of that throughout that in older people. So she's curious what was behind that storyline. A few other people have comments, but basically they all want to know, where that storyline came from.
Well, I wanted Bex and Townsend to have something that was a little bit of a barrier to their relationship. And just to be honest, like I grew up Protestant, but I went to Catholic school, and so did my son. And so I know a lot about Catholicism, and I know a lot about Protestantism, like enough that I was like, I would barely even have to do research for that. I wasn't sure that I knew enough about I wasn't sure I knew enough to even get into like if there was, a Jewish family and a Protestant family, or a Christian family. I didn't even, or like, a Muslim family. And like, I wanted it to be a religious difference, because I felt like for the time that made a whole lot of sense.
Yeah.
But what was super interesting to me is, Kristy talking about 1980. I mean, this is not in the far past. And actually, I mean, some Catholic priests that I talked to, it's not really in the past at all. I mean, they, if you're talking to them, they do not want people marrying outside of the faith. And I'm lucky, because I have a really good friend from childhood who's a Catholic priest, and he talked to me a lot about it, and about all the reasons why, and kind of helped me understand, which I still am kind of like, but I do understand. I mean, I understand that I understood intellectually what they were saying, but I'm kind of like, okay. But it is amazing to think about, what a big deal it was during that time. And so, and I almost was a little bit like, what, was it that big of a deal? Or am I making too big of a deal of it? And so I went back and started doing research. And it was amazing. Like there were entire like newspaper columns and like major publications that were dedicated to like why Catholics should only marry Catholics and why Protestants should
Wow.
only marry Protestants and things like that. And then there was that book, the book that I talk about, Mixed Marriage. That was a real book,
Wow.
like published in the year that I talked about it. And it was about, it was fiction, but it was about the disastrous effects of intermarriage. And, it was a thing. And so I felt like it was something that, would have been a hurdle to them. It would have made it harder for them to be together, but it also was something that I understood already. Like I already understood transubstantiation versus consubstantiation. And I understood like marriage is a sacrament in the Catholic Church and it's not in the Protestant. Like there were things that I already knew really well about that I was like, okay, I feel like I can approach this and not get it wrong. Like I just didn't want to, I didn't want to risk getting it wrong. And so I was like, well, I know this pretty well. So I think this will be good. And I mean, I could have chosen something else besides religion, I'm sure, but I think it felt approachable too, because it's not as big of a deal today. I didn't want it to be, I wanted you to be able to read it and understand that would have been hard for them at that time, but I didn't want it to feel like a super hot button issue in 2024.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Heaven knows we have plenty of those.
We have plenty of those. So I just was like, let's just let this be something that, there are still people who, it's a big deal too, and that's totally fine. That's great. But I, largely it's not something that we're like thinking a whole lot about. I don't feel like, or it hasn't come into my world. And, I'm from the South and live in the South. It's not something I hear about anymore.
I don't think it's not a big deal in my circles either. So
yeah. So I just felt like, and again, it might be for some people and that's totally fine. But I didn't feel like it was so like something that we were going to be fighting about on the internet later.
Right. Because we definitely don't want to do that, right?
No.
Okay, so Susie Zarenda, Susie. So she wrote in the group, asked her to talk about the real life house, perhaps the inspiration for the house in the novel, that had sat empty for many years, and when it went up for sale, and the table was still set for a long ago Thanksgiving meal.
Yeah. So when I was 10, we moved to a new house a new old house, and the house across the street came for sale for the first time in like 50 years. And it had been empty for like 50 years, or not empty. It had been closed up for 50 years. And so we went to go look at it with some of our like best family friends who this book is actually dedicated to. And when we walked in, it was a time capsule. It was literally like everyone got up from the Thanksgiving table, left, and never came back. And there was like this whole meal set at the table. The turkey was like petrified on the table. Wow. It felt like wood. But there were, newspapers on the counter and shoes by the couch and toys out in the kids' rooms. It was literally like if I just walked out the door of my house and never came back in, and you just walked in and I was living in it and then left, and they didn't die. There was nothing like, I don't 100% know what happened. Supposedly they all got in a huge fight. It was like a sort of multi-generational fight. And wow. No one could even like agree to sell the house until the entire next generation.
Wow.
So that was really interesting. And
that happened in Salisbury?
Yeah.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it's very interesting. And I'm not 100% sure that I'm correct on it, but it was in a neighborhood. So their right. HOA, like I'm sure they had to keep it up on the outside or something, right. But the inside was like completely untouched.
Interesting.
So that was very, very bizarre. And, at 10, it wasn't that bizarre because when you're 10, things are just happening to you. And it's like, everything's kind of new, I guess. So you're kind of like, oh, that's weird. But I never really thought all that much about it. Our neighbors bought it. They totally redid it. It was beautiful. And, I babysat over there every week, whatever. Like I was in there with them in there all the time. I never have thought about it yet.
Interesting thing that happened though.
Yeah, exactly. But so sitting down to start to write this book, I was like, oh, I think that's what's going to happen. She's going to walk into this time capsule. And I actually really toned it down a lot for the book because my agent and my editor were like, this isn't believable. And I was like, no, but it's a real thing that happened to me. And they were like, doesn't matter. It's not believable. It's like the psychic finding the plane. These things that you can't really say in the story because they don't seem real.
Well, sometimes truth is stranger than fiction, right?
Yeah. Oh, wait, I
Um,
have to tell you this one detail that's really gross, but I really remember. And I had this in the book and they made me take it out. And I was like, this is such a good detail. So there was a bowl of Hershey Kisses, like on
yeah.
the coffee table. And obviously I wasn't going to eat them. I knew they were 50 years old, but I remember opening one and it was like the perfect foil, but there was like almost nothing in it. Like there was like this little trace of chocolate at the bottom, but it was like the chocolate had just like disappeared.
Oh my gosh. Weird. Very weird. Okay. So, um, Cindy also asks, she says she loves the story of Bex and Townsend, and that it was heartwarming, but she wants to know, do you plan elaborate dinner parties?
Um, Not like Rebecca St. James dinner parties. And that was actually something that I really think I touched on in this story that I wasn't planning on. Like, I think it's something that must be on my brain. Although I will say, my mom's 65th is coming up and she's not a party. Like, no, I mean, she loves to have parties and she loves to entertain, but she hates to be the center of attention. And so she did not want like a big 65th birthday party. And I was like, well, what if I just have like a really beautiful small dinner party at my house with like all your best friends? And so she said I could do that. So that was good. That was big for her. It was big. So I will be having a very elaborate Rebecca St. James birthday party for my mom.
Oh, how
But
fun.
in general, I love to entertain. We have parties all the time, but um, not not Rebecca St. James parties. And I think that was part of what I was really kind of exploring in this book is that I grew up, with all of these women around me who entertained in these like very
Right.
fabulous and fine ways. And I love that. And I love the tradition of it. And in theory, I want to carry that on. But in reality, I love to have parties, but I'm also working all the time and I have a kid at home. And so my parties just don't look like that. I'm not polishing, I'm not spending a day polishing silver before I have
Yeah.
friends over. Although I will say I do use my silver all the time because now I figured out you really can just throw it in the dishwasher and it's totally fine. Just don't wash it with lemon cascade and you're okay. It looks beautiful. It comes out, you put it in the felt, you don't have to polish it at all. So there are things like that that make it a little easier. But yeah, I love to have. I think that was something that I thought a lot about is like all the things that I don't want to slip away. And like my grandmother was an incredible cook, and I'm not a great cook. My husband is a great cook. I'm not a great cook, but I am a pretty good baker. So I was like, I need to be doing these things a little more, But sometimes I'm like, why would I bake that from scratch when like so and so up the road makes the best cookies I've ever had, and I could go buy them.
So I noticed you had a lot of recipe or a lot of food in this book and a
Yeah.
couple of recipes in the back. And I was looking for those blueberry muffin recipes.
I
That
know.
wasn't in the
Okay, so those are actually kind of inspired by one of my friend's blueberry muffin recipes, and I should have asked her if I could put them in the book, but I didn't. But I'm sure she will let me share that recipe. It's
Okay,
amazing,
good.
and I'll put it on my blog or something because
Excellent.
yeah.
Because that sounded really good. I really
Oh,
wanted one of those
they're
blueberry
so
muffins.
well, especially with like that little burst of lemon.
Mhm.
They're very good.
Yeah.
And I can make
And
those. I am a good baker. I will tell you. I really am. When I do it, I'm not a good cook, but I'm a good baker.
see, I'm the exact opposite. I'm not particularly good at baking, although I do think I can pull muffins off. I
Sure.
mean, I can do it, but it's not my
Yeah,
favorite
it's
thing.
not your thing.
It's very sciencey. You've got to have things precise or things fall
Mhm.
or whatever. They don't.
Right.
This the chemistry, but I cook
Yes.
with a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and so it's sort of an art. It's more art than science,
Okay,
whereas
so you
baking
have
is
hit on something really great here because this is what it took me a long time to figure out. My husband is like you. He just throws things in. He cooks by taste and feel, and everything he makes is always really good. I am like, I have to read the recipe and it has to be just right. And so if I like make a recipe and then I taste it and I'm like, well, this doesn't taste right, then like that's it. You know, like he has to come save it because like I don't know what to do with it. But I think in baking, I mean, that's what I like about baking is the precision of it. And
right.
that like if if you follow the recipe just right, you have perfect results. Now, of course, as you know, living in different places in the South,
Mhm.
you do have to get an idea for like it's super humid in August.
Yeah.
So like that actually affects the way your cake rises just a little or whatever. But you learn those types of things along the way, I think.
Okay, one last question. What's next for you? What are you working on now?
Okay, so I'm working on copy edits for my 2025 book, which I think is going to be called Beach House Rules, which I almost hate to say because we changed the title of A Happier Life like 52 times. I think the last time I was here, I probably told you it was either called Where the Sky Meets the Sea or Last Summer on Sunset Lane, and it was neither of those. So who knows? But I think it's going to be Beach House Rules. I think everyone has signed off on that one. I don't think I can take credit for it because I don't think I came up with it, but I really like it.
It's great.
Um, but it is about I don't even know how to tell you what it's about yet. But it's about a woman whose husband has been accused of a financial crime. And she basically finds herself in a situation where her daughter's starting school for the year and she's in a sort of newish town and she really doesn't have anywhere to go. Because when something like that happens to you, your assets are frozen. And under certain circumstances, especially if there's a home office, you don't have access to your home. So she has nowhere to go. And a woman that she knows vaguely from church takes her in. She owns what used to be a bed and breakfast, and her niece and her children live there, as well as another friend and her children. And everyone in town calls them the Mommune. And there's all of this. There are a lot of swirling rumors about these women and what goes on inside the Mommune. And of course, anything that's a little bit different is something that's going to get talked about, right?
Mhm.
And so that's almost kind of like the overarching theme of this book is the way that media and social media in particular shape our perception and how we can actually use them to shape perception as well. But it was a fun book to write. So it's from the point of view of Alice, who is kind of like the house mother of all these women, and it is her house that they are living in, and like what would lead her, to this situation. And then Charlotte, who is the woman whose husband has committed the crime, allegedly, and then her 15-year-old daughter, Iris, who finds herself, obviously, with her life having changed very dramatically, mostly for the bad, but a little for the good in ways that you put down in the book. But what the women don't know is that they all have a connection that they're not aware of. And you find out what that is throughout the course of the book. So anyway.
So is this one set in Beaufort as well, or is it somewhere else?
No, this one's set in a fictional town called Juniper Shores, which
Mhm.
it's kind of a cross between, so it is in North Carolina, technically. It's kind of like Atlantic Beach, which is like near here, like right across the bridge. But it also is, it kind of reminds me of 30A in Florida too.
Okay.
There's a lot of like there's like an Airstream village like there is there, and like some things like that I sort of lifted from there. So I decided to call it something different. But there's a point of view who we don't totally know who it is that's running through the book called Juniper Shores Socialite, and she's kind of the town gossip. So that was really fun to do too, because it's kind of that old school like Greek chorus town crier sort of feel. What are people saying in this small southern town about all of these people and their goings on?
That sounds like a lot of fun. I can't wait to read it.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, is there anything else you think we should know?
No, just thanks so much for having me again and for reading my book and dealing with my what if this happened for 11 books there.
We so enjoy having you and so enjoy your books, and it's just always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Susan. Thanks for the great interview. It is always so nice of you to have me, and hope to see you soon.
See you soon. Take care.